I'm here today with David. He's the founder of Ozpol Explained, and it's actually how I got to meet David. I got onto his channel, watched his videos, thought this is highly educational about politics, a topic that I normally have zero interest in. You've made that interesting. David, welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about David and particularly what got you interested in politics?
Well, the thing that really got me into politics initially was comedians.
Yes.
Like Stephen Colbert or John Oliver.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, politics is a very sort of dry and boring subject. And so political satire is basically a vehicle for getting people into politics. Because it's funny, it's lighthearted, and then you're like, oh wait, I've learned something. I've started to care about a specific issue that you're making fun of. So, like Sean McAuliffe as well, for an Australian example, he's very good. Mad as Hell on the ABC is probably a bit more relevant to Australian audiences. But yeah, that basically, if you can find a way to make something interesting, it's a lot easier to get into that.
Well, totally. And look, I discovered that in my own way as well, doing training, doing corporate sort of style training. If you can keep the topic interesting enough and entertaining enough and playful enough, people will want to listen and their mind sort of opens up from a mindset perspective. And I guess credit to you, you've done that very well with Ozpol Explained. Now, how did Ozpol Explained sort of come about?
Well, I just kept getting asked the same questions.
Yeah.
Like every new person, they would be like, how do I vote? How do I do this? What is the point of like this position in Parliament, etc.?
Yeah.
And I figured I just want to make an accessible resource that people will just Google some questions and hopefully it will come up and they'll be like, aha, this answers all my questions, and I don't have to keep telling people or typing them out. Yeah. And I can just be like, here's something I prepared earlier, basically. I just wanted as much of a reach as possible for helping people answer the questions that they didn't know the answers to.
Well, and you're right, and I mean, obviously these days Google is so accessible, it's easy to ask any question you have. But with politics being such a dry topic, sometimes you don't even know what question to ask. For example, what's the difference between the upper house and lower house? What if you don't even know that there's an upper house and lower house? You wouldn't even know how to ask that question, right? So what's interesting to me about politics is that it's very important because it gets to decide what laws we have in our society, how things go for our economy, our health, our regulations, all sorts of different things that influences and basically impacts everybody. Yet not everybody knows enough about it. And a lot of people, I think, either don't want to vote, don't like voting, they do donkey votes, which don't count. And it makes me think perhaps more education is necessary, hence why we're having this discussion today. And people need to potentially take more interest, whether it's through comedy like you did, or whether it's through other channels like following Ozpol Explained, and start to learn and educate themselves as to how it works, how their vote counts, and what difference it makes, because every vote does make a difference, right?
Yes. Like some elections generally do come down to just like a handful of votes.
Right.
Like within a certain threshold, there can be a recount, but some politicians have got voted in on incredibly small margins.
Wow.
Like we're talking like a dozen votes, literally a dozen votes.
And then it changed everything.
Yeah.
Right.
So your people's preferences counts, people actually paying attention to their vote for counts. In some seats, like there's a very solid margin for a certain party, and some seats, like the one, like Cowan in Perth, for instance, that is a very marginal seat, and so even if like everyone else already knows who's won, like Cowan, there's still like there's like 100 vote lead for this party, it's edging away. It takes like a week or two before we actually know who wins Cowan.
Right. That's it's an
so
interesting one to look out for.
Yeah, voting can really affect who wins, and sometimes a party is only in power by one seat.
Wow.
Like 2016, we didn't know the results of the election for ages because it was so tight.
Yeah.
and Malcolm Turnbull's Liberal Party won government by 1 seat.
Wow.
So if any of his party members were not in the chamber, potentially they could have lost a vote on a bill,
Yeah.
which they didn't. But
Yeah.
not all. That's also another thing. Not all politicians show up to work all the time.
Right.
So sometimes, if there's not many politicians, if you don't have that big of a margin for government, all of a sudden showing up to work really matters.
Right, of course, because it influences the decision for passing that
Yes.
bill or getting that, heard in Parliament, etc. When people go to vote, there's usually those 2 papers. One of them is particularly long. That's the one that I usually just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 because I don't know what I'm doing with it. What difference does it make to vote above the line versus below the line?
Well, to begin with, there's 2 ballots because there's 2 chambers. There's
Right.
one for the House of Representatives. That's a green piece of paper. It's going to be smaller.
Yeah.
You fill out all those boxes, and those are for the parties that are running in your electorate, which is like a collection of suburbs, basically.
Yeah.
The other one, the Senate paper, which is really big, that is for your whole state, basically. And so above the line lists the parties, and then below the line lists the individual candidates for those parties. So you pick one or the other. Above the line, it's you fill in at least 6 of those boxes with your preferences, and that's basically like, I like this party, I like this party a little bit less, I like this party the least. Very simple, but some people, they're really into politics and they care about the individual candidates. So under the line, you're like, I really like Bob, right? And so you put Bob number 1. And then you may be like, oh, I do like the party Bob is in, but I also really feel like this independent or this other candidate from another party is also really good. Like, as an individual, actually really cares. So I'm going to put that person number 2. And then I can come back to the same party and I can put the next person number 3. And it's just more choice about how you preference who you want in Parliament.
Right. So there's that preferential, is that what you'd call it?
Yes, we have a system called preferential voting. So the way that works, right, is you will put like number 1, 2, 3, etc. And sometimes there isn't like a clear winner.
Right.
So you've got like, let's really simplify it. Let's say there's 3 parties and they all get 33% of people's number 1 preferences.
Right.
And you're like, but who's going to win?
Yes.
So what you do is you knock off the person who has like the least amount of votes, and then you look at everyone's number 2 preferences.
Yes.
And that way, all those preferences then like flow towards one party or the other,
Right.
and then you can find a winner.
Okay.
Like who is if there's no one party that is like everyone's
Stand out.
absolute favorite,
Yeah.
at least we need to find a party that is on average preferable to the most amount of people.
Right.
So
And then I guess there's also the preferences that the parties have, because then the parties kind of negotiate within themselves, right? Or between them and other parties to sort of see.
no one chooses your preferences but you.
Right.
There used to be like preference deals do exist, but the way that preference deals really eventuate is through how to vote cards.
Right.
So like you go to a ballot, you on election day, you rock up, there's a bunch of volunteers and they're like, hey, here's a how to vote card. Do you know how to vote? And it has correct information. It tells you how to fill in a ballot paper, but it also gives you suggestions like fill in number 1 for party A because I'm party A and I've given you this piece of paper, but also, hey, maybe you should put number 2 next to party B, number 3 next to party C.
So kind of influencing the voters.
Yeah. So it kind of influences some people, but if you already have an opinion,
Yeah.
it does not matter.
Right.
So these sort of like preference deals are just a way to try and get voters who aren't really decided past number 1 to then put some preferences
Yeah.
in a way that would help that party. So some like right-wing parties would be like, oh, hey, you should preference like this right-wing party, like and then the votes sort of like stay together, and then eventually the preferences will eventually lead to one right-wing party getting elected.
Yeah.
And basically sort of on the other side of the spectrum as well. You know, like we all got to work together, but hey, maybe you should vote for this other person as like the backup.
Right.
And eventually one of these parties or a major party ends up benefiting from these preference flows.
Okay, got it. That makes sense.